Hey everyone, how's it going? Gonna get this started, all right? So, before I get started, I always like to thank my hosts, Jordan and Custom Rod and Reel. This will be our second seminar here, and it's just, it's great meeting great people. And, the guys at Custom Rod and Reel, this is like a family shop. You come in here, you get the real deal. I love my conversations with Mike Tice. We can go deeper into any subject than any person that I can go into, and it's always a pleasure to be here. Mike, Jordan, all the guys here at the shop, thank you so much. So my name's Seth Funt. Grew up in the Northeast. Lived down here in Florida for the last 20 years. I spend my time back and forth, and I get to fish and do a lot of unbelievable stuff, and I have to say, the snapper fishing is absolutely at the top of one of my absolute favorite things to do. It's a fishery where we can go out, and I know we're going to have a lot of success, but I know that anybody that I'm bringing, whether you're a seasoned angler or you've never done this before, it's absolutely one of the most exciting things to do. There's no pressure. There doesn't have to be a huge expense associated with it. But more importantly, at the end of the day, you have something great to eat. And, as we got into this fishery, we started out bottom fishing in Palm Beach, right? Up and down the coast, snapper and grouper, it's a pretty common fish to catch. The way we target the fish that are local here in the Florida waters, a little bit different than the way we target them in the Bahamas. But most of the fishing that we're doing here, it's either kingfish, tournament fishing, or mostly sail fishing. But I have to say, if you're sail fishing all day and you're fishing with people that don't get a chance to fish a lot, at the end of the day, you have a bunch of rags in the riggers, but you really have nothing to eat. And a lot of people, the whole experience of going fishing is to bring something good to eat home. So snapper fishing was something we always incorporated into the day. And there's times that the sail fishing gets slow and the snapper fishing's good, and we'll sort of put a kite out, but we'll really focus on bottom fishing. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is local fishing, snapper, grouper, Florida coast. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a journey over to the east side into the Bahamas, and we're going to talk about the difference in the way we target them there. So locally here, most of the fish are going to be oriented near the reef structure, which can be anywhere from like 60 to, call it 150 feet. That's really the zone where we're targeting these fish. I would say that, and like you've all experienced this, the current can vary a tremendous amount on a day-to-day basis. So locally here, I would say we're fishing more braid outfits. 30-pound braid, 40-pound braids are, braid of choice. And you got to scale the weight to appropriate to get the bait on the bottom, and that could be anywhere from 2 ounce, 3 ounce, 4 ounce, 5 ounce. Somewhere in that range is where we're fishing weight-wise. The rig is fairly simple. It's a 15-foot leader, or I like to say 3 pulls, because each pull is about 5 feet. So about 3 pulls. Normally, and in fact, most of the time, we're using 30-pound fluorocarbon. So 3 pulls of 30-pound fluorocarbon, to a swivel, and above the swivel is a lead. Now, I like to travel with a lot of different size leads on the boat, and I have a couple of different case packs of leads. I have leads that go from 3, 4, 5, 6, and I have stuff that's much smaller. And when we get out there, you kind of have to look at the GPS, and you have to figure out, well, what's my drift speed? Are we going at 1.5 knots, 2 knots, 3 knots? If I find that I get up to about 4 to 5 ounces of lead and I still can't hold bottom, I might move in a little bit shallower. And I would say my favorite depth to start fishing for bottom fish local here is about 100 to 120 feet. That's right around the spot where if the Gulf Stream's really ripping, that's going to be the depth where I'm really going to target most of my time. 100 to 120, 130 feet, okay? My favorite baits here, whatever's fresh. So in just thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I have to say that a lot of things have changed over the last couple of years. The ability to get fresh bait has become a little bit more difficult in my opinion. So one thing that I've definitely started doing more of is when I visit a tackle store and I open up the bait freezers and I look at the selection of baits, I might look at everything from cigar minnows, frozen gogs, frozen sardines, and I might start flipping a handful of boxes just to see what the qualities of the bait are. There's times that a batch of bait will come in that it's absolutely pristine and beautiful. It's somewhere caught locally, usually on the West Coast. And when I see fresh baits like that, usually what I'll do is I'll take that opportunity to buy way more than I'm going to need just for a day. I'll stock myself up for a season as soon as the fresh batches of bait start to come in. So, and again, you know, bait can come different parts of the year. We get imported bait. Sometimes you get bait that's holdover from, 6-7 months ago. So when I'm bottom fishing, I'm definitely trying to procure the best quality baits that I can get, whether that's mullet, cigar minnows, goggle eye's my favorite, sardines for sure. But I can't tell you how important it is. How productive you are during the course of a day is directly correlated to the quality of your baits. If you have garbage bait, it's difficult to fish and have a great day of fishing on bad bait. So again, just coming back to hoarding bait when I find good bait. If I walk into a shop and I see good bait, I might buy 6 or 7 cases and freeze that stuff for the season. And then as my trips start to unwind, I'll pick away at it. I want to talk about the bait a little bit. With the exception of when we're Bahamas fishing and I'm able to get a lot of goggle eyes in the springtime, this is a product that a lot of people look at in the store, and unless you're trolling ballyhoo or something, you might just walk right past this, not even think twice about it. And I would say that, one thing that me and the guys, my brothers, that we put a lot of effort into is, if you think about tournament sail fishing, whether you're dead baiting or live baiting, the guys really at the top that are real performers spend a tremendous amount of time procuring the right baits. Same thing with bottom fishing. You have to spend a lot of time prepping that bait to have an unbelievable day. And I don't think it's very difficult. You just have to follow a few simple steps. If I know we're going to bottom fish, the night before we go bottom fishing, I pull my cases of bait out. I'll put a bucket of seawater on them. I'll put 1 full container of brine on them, and I'll let them defrost overnight. Because the worst thing you can do is go out for a day of bottom fishing, buy your bait in the morning, flip it open on the deck, you're ready to start fishing, half the bait on the top is soggy and soft, half the bait is frozen solid. You go to pull the bait off, usually you're damaging the bait right out of the gate by pulling it off frozen. Take some time and put some love into your baits. A big mantra of mine, whether I'm snapper fishing or tuna fishing or sword fishing or whatever I'm doing, I try to put 20% extra effort into absolutely everything I do, and it pays off 50% of the time. So let's talk about this bait preparation. I usually take my baits, I put them in a case, I put them in a cooler, I'll throw a bucket of seawater on them, and I'll put brine. Another brine that I love to use is baking soda and iodized salt, 50-50 mix. What we're going to do with that is you're going to firm the bait up a little bit. A lot of times these baits, if it's cigar minnows, it's skin. If it's sardines, it's scales. Ballyhoo, scales. Goggle eyes, skin. I want to try to firm that bait up a little bit. Give it just a little bit more oomph and my ability to fish that bait during the day. So as I defrost my baits, we get to the boat in the morning. Baits have had a chance to kind of cool down slowly in a nice salty brine. The baits get separated, and what we do is we take a pair of scissors and I'll neatly detail the baits. For me, detailing the baits, if it's cigar minnows or sardines, I take the tails off. I lobe the tail at the top and the bottom. Try not to expose any meat. I like to clip the fins off the side, and I lay them in a bait tray and keep them out of the water. Nice and cold, very well organized. Head, tail, head, tail, head, tail. side by side, sprinkling a little bit of salt between the layers. As we get going during the day, what you'll notice is there'll be like a flurry of bites, and if your baits aren't ready to go out of the cooler and you're fumbling with frozen blocks of whatever you have, you're going to miss that opportunity to get that flurry. So we fish that same way all throughout the year, and I have to say, whether it's snapper fishing very quickly turns into a great cobia bite. Cobia bite usually happens February, March for us, right in that same depth zone. But if you're not ready when you go through the biomass of, whatever, usually it's whitetail grunts they're feeding on. If you're not ready to reload the baits real quick, you might miss the whole day. So bait preparation in our operation is absolutely paramount. Another thing we do, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail when we get to the Bahamas, but goggle eyes are absolutely one of my favorite baits to fish. I butterfly everything at the dock. Everything gets neatly stacked in a bait cooler in the cooler. I made a quick post earlier, and it showed my bait cooler has 3 different offerings that we can have. Usually when we're bottom fishing, it's goggle eye, cigar minnows, and sardines. And I have somebody on the boat that's dedicated to reloading the bait as we're going. So we'll usually start out with 2 cases of each different offering. Everything is detailed, and as we start to run low, I'll usually have my guys start prepping baits to make sure that we never run low on any one thing. So let me now transition back to the snapper and the grouper locally. Most of the grouper and most of the snapper we catch here are going to be a little bit smaller size. I would say that most of the mutton snapper we see here, you'll see like a trend of like a lot of short fish. Excuse me, that brisket was amazing. You'll see a trend where you'll pick at small fish, and then you'll get a keeper. Pick small fish, and then you'll get a keeper. You stick with it during the course of a day. At the end of a day, you open the cooler up, you have a pretty nice pick for the day. Grouper fishing around here, so much like in our region, call it 30, 40 miles to the north, 34 miles to the south. Red grouper, might get a few other species mixed in, but it's not really something that we can really target with any kind of regularity here. So, Bahamas, another story. But locally here, mutton snapper, African pompanos, cobia, that's sort of our bottom. That's what we're really targeting here. Over on the other side, it's a completely different story, and we'll get to that in a minute. But fishing here locally, if I could give you one big tip for how to really make a difference between a good day and a great day, is bait selection and keeping the leaders fresh and clean. A lot of times locally here, and Mike and I have talked about this before, it seems like the mutton snappers tend to orientate around a lot of structure. When you're fishing in fast current and you're fishing around a lot of structure, it's not uncommon for us to have, we're drifting along, and 3 of the 4 guys that are fishing on the boat all get busted off on the wreck, hang up on the wreck. Reel the rod up, try and re-rig as fast as you can. Or what we like to do on the boat is, just like tournament sail fishing, I'll have a whole bunch of setups ready to go. So if somebody breaks off, put the rod down, let the rigger on the boat re-rig the rod, pick up another rod, launch, and just keep going, keep fishing. It's all about repetition. The longer you can keep baits on the bottom, the more chance you have for success. Let me think. Questions so far on what I've talked about so far? I love the questions, so if you have any questions, just hit me with them, all right? Otherwise, we're just going to keep moving. Yes?
So you're talking mostly about drifting at the bottom. Do you ever just drop anchor and fish with the current into structures?
Okay, so it's a really good question, and there are times that I've seen people anchored up mutton snapper fishing. That's not my style. I feel like the more ground you can cover, the quicker I can determine where the fish are actually located. And when I do find the fish, I tend to just short drift it. So I might drift for 10 or 15 minutes, pick up, reset on that line with a little bit of a augment to it, and just continue to sweep that spot. So I feel like, when we have 1 to 3 knots of current, I like to be able to cover 12 miles of beach and figure out where in that 12 miles are the fish sort of stacking, And I do like to fish shallow to deep, and I really want to have a wide rake, right, of fishing the bottom. One other thing that I would hit on is usually in the spring and the summertime we get this spawn, but it's a little bit different in the Bahamas than it is here. On the spawn, the fish tend to move off the patch reefs and into the shallow and the sand where there's not as many predators, where they can kind of do their thing without being bothered. So in the springtime, I find that the fish will move in much shallower than they do in the wintertime. So it's not uncommon for us to have a great mutton snapper bite in 40, 50, 60 feet of water, which depending on where you are in Florida, that could be, up in Stewart, that could be an 8-mile run. Locally here, our reef is relatively compressed. But if you're not finding them in that 1 to 130 foot range, don't be afraid to make a big slide inside. A lot of times you'll see the drift boats in there, and when they're struggling and they just need to put customers on fish, you'll see them drifting in very odd spots, 45, 55, 60 feet of water. And then again, it's not uncommon for us to make the leap to the other side and go fish 180. A lot of things start to change in 180 feet. Now there's a lot more current to contend with. And I feel like when we're fishing in heavy current, it's way more challenging for a novice angler to be able to feel the bottom and really present the bait properly. Just to kind of go back to what I was saying, most of the rigs that we fish, I call them slider rigs. Call them whatever you want, but the weight is above the swivel, the leader, the hook, the bait. If I let out line, the lead tends to, the swivel moves away from the weight. The fish can eat the bait without feeling the weight. It's a very delicate presentation. But once you start to get into a situation where you have to use 4, 5, 6 ounces of lead, it's very difficult to make a proper presentation to the fish because there's just so much lead, there's a lot of line, there's a lot of current. It just becomes a little bit more difficult. So, again, deeper water can be good at times, and I have found some of the bigger muttons that we've caught here locally will be resident more to the wrecks out in 150, 160, 180, 200. But it becomes a little more challenging to get the bait and present it. That might be a situation where anchoring up would be the way to do it. Personally, for me, I feel like anchoring in those depths with these currents, if something's to go wrong, you could have a lot of problems. And like I said before, I like being able to cover a lot of bottom because I feel like when I do find them, that short drift, and we'll get into that in a minute, but that short drift really changes everything, Because as I start to chunk and chum the water, the bite starts to develop. You can anchor up, but you remember if you're using that 3-to-1 ratio of anchor, it's 300 feet of rope plus chain. Hope you don't get stuck in something. Probably a little easier in 60 foot off a moon, because when we get the moon tides, everything is moving a lot faster. If we have a south wind here, it just accelerates everything. Mike and I were talking, and he seemed to develop a pattern, or at least identify a pattern, where after a north blow, right after a north blow, we would get a pretty decent grouper bite. But again, after seeing some of the stuff we see in the Bahamas, it's very difficult for me to wrap my head around going fishing to catch red groupers that are borderline legal. It's not something I spend a lot of time doing. It's really the mutton snappers that I'm after. So, yes?
Seth, are you rigging your baits? Well, just talk about how you rig the minnows and your gogs and stuff, and then you do lots of bycatch down there, or you have to shake out baits frequently?
Okay. So, when you're fishing 30-pound leader, I feel like a circle hook is the best presentation. When I first started fishing here, we used to use triple hooks. Jordan has them here. It's something we use from time to time, but it's 3 hooks that hold into the bait. And you would have to use that because the trigger fish and everything were just so bad that unless you were fishing a triple hook, you were never able to keep the bait down there for more than a few minutes before the triggers and the nonsense would just absolutely destroy the bait. Up here I have 3 different styles of hooks. For me it's circle hook, and for me it's doesn't matter what one of those 3 baits you're using, even mullet, include mullet in that list. It's always from the bottom to the top and out the front with a nice clean hook presentation. Circle hook, offset, and I carry everything I have up here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'll make a hook change if I'm changing a bait. I'll make a hook change if I miss a fish. I'll make a hook change if the next box of baits is a little bit bigger or smaller than the last box. I'm changing my hook out until I figure out for that particular day and that particular bait and those particular size fish where the right recipe is, right? These hooks can change just a little bit in size, but that incremental change is critical because let's say I'm using a big bait and an appropriate size hook for that bait, and I'll tell you how to size them in a minute. But all the bites I'm getting are from juvenile fish. Might have to scale it down and change bait to actually hook that fish. So hook selection is critical. And we have 3 different styles of hooks. You know, I fish the light Mutu, the regular Mutu, and then I also fish the BKK hooks. When we get more into like the Bahamas, I think I'm going to start to shed a little bit more light on hook selection and bait size.
Now, Seth, do you fish with a rod in your right hand and a beer in your left hand? Or do you wait till after you're done fishing to enjoy a nice cold beverage?
Usually when I'm running a boat, I don't drink at all.
Got it. Just curious.
I don't drink when I'm on the water. And
Sometimes, it's so boring and you gotta just
yeah, I mean, I encourage the guys. If it's good, I give them a beer. That's the great thing about this particular fishery. It's a lot of fun. There's really no stress, you know?
How do you rig the frozen gogs?
I don't rig frozen gogs.
Dead gog.
So I actually have some gogs that the boys brought in that they killed in a bucket for me. And I'll show you at another section of the seminar how I rig those baits and which hooks I use and how I size them. But the takeaway from all this is that mutton snapper fishing, grouper fishing, this is meant to be a fun fishery, no stress. If you're a good fisherman and you're taking out people that have no idea what you're doing, no idea what they're doing, this is an absolute great way to introduce them into the sport, you know? If you have kids, it's great because it's nonstop action. Yes?
I have a question. Okay, so going back to kids and like novices or people who aren't familiar with drift fishing, could you explain like a typical, like a drift, like a drop, like dropping your bait
Yes.
to the bottom, letting it hit bottom once, tell them what to feel for. What do you prefer? Put it in gear, crank it up a couple times, you know, as the bottom varies. Can you explain that?
So I have a bunch of different rigs here, and we're going to go kind of through all this stuff. But if I was fishing locally here on the Florida side, I want a rod and braid. We talked about this. If I'm putting this rod in the hand of somebody that has no idea what they're doing, here's how I explain it to them. I'm going to rig the bait. We're going to put it in the water. You're going to let the bait down slowly. If you let the bait down too fast, it'll spin up the leader and you're not going to catch anything. What I always tell people is I want the bait to go back with the weight in front of the bait. If the bait starts going down too fast, like I said, it'll sort of helicopter up and make a mess. Keep letting line out until the line stops and you can feel the bottom. If I can see that the person's having a hard time feeling the bottom, on the next come up, I'll increase the lead size. And I'll continue to increase the lead size until they have a good sense of what the bottom feels like. After a few drifts, once they're used to that, I might start scaling back the weight again. Because this fishery and being successful in it, in my opinion, is not about having the bait and the rod and everything straight up and down. You want to have a nice 15 to 20 to 25 degree scope on the line. You want everything kind of scoped out. And again, I'll start heavy and lighten the load as we go. But getting the bait to the bottom, giving it a lift, feeling it touch the bottom again, I'll talk to people about, well, what do you feel? Does it feel sandy? Does it feel muddy? Does it feel sticky? You know, sometimes they have to hang bottom once or twice for them to understand you kind of have to let it hit the bottom and then elevate the rod tip a little bit. But each time that we're doing this, we're letting out an increment of line. So it might be 20, 30 feet every time you hit the bottom. Let it back a little bit. Do you feel the triggerfish starting to give it a little bit of a tug? The mutton snapper usually is a quick couple of jolts, boom, boom, nothing. Boom, boom. And either he's got the bait or either you're going to get tight or you have nothing there and you're fishing on credit. The best way I can explain it to people is this is a game of cycling a lot of bait. The better you get at it, the easier it's going to be for you to identify a bait, give the fish a drop back. I like to say it's, you know, from the time you feel the da-da-da, I want you to give them 40 feet of line. Just with your thumb on the reel, gently give him back 40 feet of line, engage the reel, and just give it a slow pull and see if there's pressure there. Fishing circle hooks, you can't just immediately hammer the fish. So I'll have this discussion two ways. To the person that doesn't know what they're doing, circle hook fishing is a great way to fish because once you hook the fish, he's hooked. Circle hook fishing can be very difficult for novice people because they tend to want to swing on the rod tip and set the hook. And you can't set the hook with a circle hook, giving it a good swing. You have to give him a drop back, let him eat the bait, and when you engage the reel, you're tight. Just to kind of add something to that, me standing over somebody's shoulder that doesn't know what they're doing, if we're fishing 40-pound braid and 30-pound leader, you can't have the reel locked up. It's got to be nice and gentle and light. I like a sailfish drag, 4, 5, 6 pounds of drag. You know, just enough that when you're retrieving the bait, line's not going out, but enough that if there's a fish there, it's enough to keep it tight. Does that answer the question?
It does. It does. It's huge because there's a lot of opinions on it, and to share with someone who's new is daunting.
If I'm fishing with a group of people that has never done this before, I'll start with heavy leads, and I might not even start with my premium baits. I'm going to start with squid. Something that I don't care if we catch fish. I just want them to get a feel for what the bottom feels like and what a bite feels like. And once we've established that, then we can start developing the angler as the day goes on with lighter leads, more delicate baits, the drop back. Not something I might start. If I have a crew of people that have fished before, guys that are really seasoned tuna anglers that want to get good at this quickly, I would say the less lead to feel the bottom, the better, right? You want to fish just enough lead that you can tag bottom, but not enough that you're straight up and down. You want to have a good scope angle. Any other questions so far, locally?
What kind of lead are you using? An egg sinker or
Egg sinkers.
egg sinkers?
Egg sinkers. 3 ways really don't work here. I feel like being able to let the line pass through the weight is critical. Enough for the fish to turn around and eat it, and that lead kind of has a little play in the line.
Let the lead slide right to the hook, or do you break it up to the little?
In the Keys, I think they call them knocker rigs in the Keys, where the lead basically goes all the way to the hook. The hook sits on top of the lead, right? Here locally, I want a 15-foot leader in our region, okay? Tony, I think in spots like the Keys, they have their own minute sort of fishery where they fish it a certain way. It does work, and it can work here, but for me, this 15-foot leader and given a little bit of distance between the lead and the hook, for me is translated to like a box that I can bring home and be proud of. You know? In the Keys, I don't think they have as much current where they're fishing. So I think in areas where there's a lot of current, you need to give yourself a little more lead to present it, a little more leader to present it properly. So that's our lead, you know? You can catch them on butterfly jigs. You can catch them. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can catch mutton snappers. I've found natural bait's the best way to target these fish. Micro pitching, slow pitching. Yes, you can catch mutton snappers. I had a client the other day, just had a really difficult time being able to hold the bottom and fish the bait and just really couldn't get it dialed in. We gave him a jig, and he was able to catch fish after fish, a lot of blue runners, small muttons. Yes, he had some keeper muttons, and yes, it works. But I think the bait element for sure is the best way to sort of fill up a cooler.
And are you fishing like sandy bottom adjacent to reef edges and like sandy bottom adjacent to, you know, artificial wrecks and stuff? Like how are you keeping the bait out of the reef?
Different sections of the reef present a different way, right? So up in Jupiter, Palm Beach, the reef runs east-west. Once you get in a depth line, you might have a few contours. But like I said before, this is a game of just cycle. You're going to break off tackle, you're going to hook fish, you're going to lose fish, you're going to hook the bottom, you're going to hook a lot of stuff down there. It's just a process of finding a nice spot that you're comfortable with in a nice depth zone where you're able to get a good presentation and just pounding it. Just pounding it, repetition. We're able to have pretty decent success here because I think we're doing 4 or 5 anglers at a time. Everything's prepped, everything's ready to go. We're efficient with it. If you're doing 1 rod at a time, it's a little bit different. It's a little difficult to sort of fill the box that way.
I think I told you I could do some free-dive spear fishing, and we find the muttons on like the sandy section most often, probably because they're feeding on those worms that are coming out of the sand. They're pretty skittish compared to lots of fish. I don't know why, but they like to keep the distance, and they're smart in that regard.
I think spearfishing muttons on this side is very difficult. That 60-foot range with the speed of current to chase that fish at that depth, it's not an easy thing to do.
But to your point, in the spring, we do see them a little shallower, so, and some nice ones too.
Yeah, so do we have any other questions about fishing locally here? Because I think once we get over to the Bahamas, there's been a lot of, for me, very interesting things that I've learned about this fish and catching these fish in serious numbers and spots that I never thought that they would, were able to be caught.
Probably applies to both, but just, again, the theme of having a few guys that may not know exactly what they're doing. How do you keep people from tying up with each other and keeping organized? You said you got 4 lines in the water, so I'm curious. The back of the boat, what do you have? So how are you organizing things?
So as the captain, I'll sort of identify who are going to be my strong players and who are going to be my weak players. The weaker players, if I have a bunch of kids on the boat and they've never really fished before, I'll go heavy on the lead. I want them sort of straight up and down. The guys who sort of understand the concept, I'll let them fish a little more scoped out. So I want some people straight up and down and some people scoped out. I think when we're on a boat where you have 5 or 6 guys that really know what they're doing, it's a function of one guy fishing, starting, getting the bait in the water, bumping the bottom and letting it slide back. And the next guy is going in the water when he's already scoped back. So essentially it's like a wheel. It's a wheel in the front, it's a wheel in the back, and it's a wheel in the middle. And we're all just trying to, one thing is the guys that are in the front should be pointing off the front, and the guys that are in the back should be pointing off the back. That gives us another 7 feet of stretch. It can get complicated, and I think somebody's got to kind of be watching and quarterbacking. But when you're cycling through that much stuff, it's about repetition, it's about trying not to get tangled. And if you have people that just don't know what they're doing, heavy. Just start off heavy. Straight up and down. And again, if tangling up is something that's a problem, try and incrementally get in a little bit shallower each time you go. Each drift you take, drift a mile or 2, kind of reset, go in a little bit. Try and find where the sand meets the rock. That's really where those fish like to be, where the sand interfaces with the rock. Is there another question back here? We good? Locally? Muttons locally. it's a fun thing to do, but really, you know, where I think this is all going to get exciting is, guess it was about 12 years ago. I went over to the Bahamas, and man, we were rigged for bear. I had, you know, cases and cases of sardine, everything pre-cut, ready to go, buckets ready to go. I mean, I'm telling you, I was ready for Armageddon. I wake up in the morning to go at sunrise, and it's blowing 25 knots. We're not going fishing in this. And now I'm worried about just getting home. And I was fishing right between a weather window where it just started to howl. And I thought I could catch the window, and the weather moved forward by 12 hours. I wake up, it's blowing 25 knots. It's white capping. And I'm thinking, let's just go out front. Let's get rid of this bait. Let's fish for 30 or 40 minutes, clean the boat up, and go home. I pull out of West End. I go 2 miles to the north. I start unloading the buckets. I'm looking in the water, and all I see is 10 to 15 pound mutton snappers swimming around eating the chunks. For the next 3 hours, we bailed the mutton snappers, and I absolutely sort of rethought that whole little area that I always overlooked, which is the inlets, the reef structure, and everything close right in the Bahamas, everywhere from 10 feet to 50 feet of water. I mean, I'm telling you guys, at times this past season, we were fishing into 10 feet of water, almost sight fishing these fish. Here's what we've learned from then to now. You have to get rid of the braid in the Bahamas. It's all a mono fishery, okay? 20-pound mono, 30-pound mono. That's it. I'm fishing no more than ½ ounce, 3/4 ounce, right about there. These two size leads is all I'm really using. I'm using a 15-foot leader. There's guys that I fish with that like it longer. I don't really think you need to fish more than that. 15 feet, same hook, but here's the difference. When we get over to the Bahamas and I do a drift, and sometimes, you know, the wind can really change the drift. Sometimes the wind over there in that shallow of a water, the wind affects the drift more than the tide does. So let's just say we're over there and it's an east wind. I'm getting blown off the bank. West wind, I'm getting blown up the bank. South wind that way, north wind this way. When I get over there, I'm really targeting 50 to say 20 feet of water. When I get on a drift, I'll chunk hard. Chunk, 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 chunk. And the reason I'm chunking there is because the critters can be really difficult to contend with. So if we start firing baits back, the trigger fish are on you almost immediately. I have to feed the trigger fish to keep them away from the prized fish. So chunking, and I would say a case adrift is about the ratio that I need to burn in order to keep the trigger fish happy so that I can present my baits properly. The other thing is, it's very important to understand your drift line, because once I do a drift and I've laid down chunk, I want to go back and reset on that exact same drift and run over it again, because each consecutive drift is going to get better with time. I'll let that run about 5 drifts before I start thinking about going to another spot. And here's the other thing, and the divers that we put in the water in the areas that I find to be the best mutton snapper fishing, they'll get up after 30, 45 minutes of diving around. They'll look up to me and they're like, this looks absolutely barren. There is no life here whatsoever. Those are the types of areas where the method I'm going to show you here is the most effective. Because what happens is in the Bahamas, you have areas where you have big, vast sand patches of nothing. That's the areas where the snappers are going to live. Once you start to get to where the reef structure starts, that's where the grouper, that's where the barracuda, that's where the sharks are going to live. You take this same method and you go 5 miles up the bank a little bit, and you can't keep the baits away from barracuda. You can't keep the baits away from juvenile and small sharks. And you can't keep the baits away from strawberry groupers. It's just constant. So we found that the best mutton snapper fishing that you're going to have is going to be up on the sand flats, in the area and the depths where the conchs live. You know, that's another sort of function of mutton snapper fishing that a lot of people overlook. One of the greatest experiences you can have fishing for mutton snappers and being in the Bahamas is take a local out to go dive conch. Let them jump in the water and harvest conch and crack conch. It's a great way to support the Bahamian people. But I find that conch might be the greatest mutton snapper bait in this side of, you know, the hemisphere. That's what those fish are really eating. You know, there's a lot of conch that you'll see that have chunks missing out of the edges, and that's for mutton snappers. They'll follow the conchs around, they'll follow that slime trail around, and when they're not paying attention, they'll peck at the conchs. They're eating the crabs, they're eating everything that conch is kicking up. That's where those fish live. Those fish live way up on the bank, off and away from where everything else lives. Questions about that?
What was the depth you said again?
So, what's the area that you fish the most? Isaac's? Isaac's? Because Isaac's is a little bit different than, say,
You said like West End, like where you were talking.
okay, so West End. If you're to come out the inlet and look to the north, you have 50 miles from the east to the west and another 50 miles to the edge of the bank. That triangle, the little Bahama bank, that whole bank is absolutely loaded with mutton snappers. Up the bank. Up on the bank. Up on the bank. 20 feet of water. As you get closer to the ledge, the life starts to increase, so do the critters. So do the sharks. We like to target these fish up in the shallows. 20 feet, 30 feet. That's where I've found that the biggest mutton snappers live. You know, it's not uncommon for us to see fish pushing 15, 18 pounds or bigger. You know, the one thing that I would preface this by saying, let's respect this fishery. You know, I'm telling you this stuff because I want you to become better fishermen and I want you to enjoy this fishery, but harvesting muttons that are absolutely at the edge of how big they get, number one, those fish are more likely to carry ciguatera. And number two, they don't taste as good as the smaller fish. So we try and cull the fish as we're fishing. I don't like to keep the fish that are this big. You know, they just don't taste that good. The fillets are that big, and they're not as, you know, safe to eat as, say, the borderline. You know, we always want to be within the Florida regulations of a size of a fish, but that tends to be the best eating fish too. The smaller sized fish, but above the legal keep rec size limit. So let me talk a little bit about rod and bait. Who's got the? Can somebody grab that goggle eye for me? Grab those gogs for me. Do you have a question? Yes.
I guess I'm curious. So you're able to fish the ½ ounce, 3/4 ounce because you're just catching a lot less current because you're so shallow, or because you're not actually fishing bottom like you would over here?
So I find that those fish aren't. Sometimes they're on the bottom, sometimes they're suspended, but you know, when we're talking about 20 feet of water, 30 feet of water, fish don't need to eat it off the bottom. In fact, I often think that the technique that I'm about to show you, the less the lead, the better. The lead is really meant to kind of get the bait down to the bottom, get the bait away from the boat. But the key to the whole technique is once the bait is scoped away from the boat, when I say scoped, I mean like at the other end of that parking lot. I want to be able to sweep the bait back to the boat, making the bait sort of swim. I want to swim the bait back to the boat. If we were to use this method anywhere where there's a lot of structure, the barracudas are going to eat you alive. I'm not saying that some of the best fishing I've ever seen over there isn't on the reef structure, but the mutton snapper fishing tends to be better where there's just sand. Nothing for you to hang up on. Maybe you want to come over here so I can show you how I cut this. So I use a paring knife. I try to get new ones every time I go. and I try and get fresh gogs. Frozen is fine. This can get a little bit expensive, but if you really want to try and target fish that are like pushing border record size fish, I think this is the bait of choice. I butterfly these fish and I fish them like this, okay? I definitely want 2 flaps and I definitely want a tail, okay? Now there's times that we're fishing this bait and I'll reel the bait in and maybe 1 flap is gone and maybe the tail section is gone and there's 1 flap left. I'll still fish that bait because I think what happens is the mutton snappers come up and boom, boom, he'll take a couple of snaps at it. If you don't do the drop back at the right time and you miss him, you still have a pretty healthy offering to give that fish. The goggle eye head itself is a pretty substantial meal for any fish. When I size the bait and I size the hook, for that particular bait, I'm going to go with a 5.0 Mutu. And I just also want to point out, the boys here at the shop were nice enough to sort of replicate what I do on my boat, which is I try to have these packs where I have my hooks from 2 to 6. I have everything opened up and ready to go. I'll usually do 1 in the front and 1 in the back. I'll look at the box, size the hook, pull it out, and I have a lot of different options here. Because when you get gogs, they come in all different sizes. All gogs, unlike sardines, unlike cigar minnows, mullet, same thing, similar. They have a nice big jaw structure at the bottom. So what I like to do is stick my finger right in the bottom of the gills and sort of flare out the bottom. And I like to get the hook right at the V and then out the lips. Okay? That's how we're presenting the bait. Now when you put this in the water and you pull it, it's unbelievably remarkable what this looks like as it's coming back to the boat. It looks alive. You can't get that same action unless he's butterflied. This works great with frozen bait, but fresh bait, if you can get it, fresh gogs, absolutely the best mutton bait that you can fish. Second, to maybe conch. But essentially what I'm trying to do with this is I want to get that bait nice and far away from the boat. I want to try and pan the bait back. And again, let me just point out that when we're in the Bahamas and I'm mutton fishing, I like about a 7.5 foot rod. I'm going to go into the rods here in a little bit, but 20-pound mono, this style of reel, this is the meat reel. A Torium 16 paired on one of these Jigging World rods is absolutely my favorite outfit. What's critical about the rod is when I'm swimming the bait, let's say I have a 1/4 of a spool of line off the reel and I'm giving the rod a pull, you can feel the bait swimming. And you can feel the mutton snapper take his initial pound. And I have enough rod to do a very quick drop back and let him eat it. 20-pound mono is my preferred sort of line of choice for big mutton snappers. You could go up to 30, but I always carry, 2 spare spools on the boat with me. Something that's $30, I can respool everybody on the boat 3 times with just that spool. After a session, I'll dump the reels and put a fresh top shot on the reels. But 20-pound mono, about a 3/4 ounce lead, a swivel, and for the gogs, I like 5 and 6.0 Mutu hooks. That's definitely, without a doubt, the hook for this fishery. Something about that stout hook, something about the jaw structure, and the way that they attack it and feed on it, I feel like you're not really getting them in the latch. You're not purchasing the hook in the bone. You're getting them in the lips in the front, and that's really where you want to hook these fish. My brother-in-law, Dave, and I bring in these heads all the time. We've tried with all these different hooks to try and figure out what's the right shape to get the mutton snapper. And if you look at the jaw structure, it's a little bit of a difficult pairing because that jaw structure is very strong. I mean, they eat a lot of crab, they attack a lot of conch, and they have a very thick jaw structure. The other thing about the bones is the density of those bones allows that fish to stay on the bottom. It wasn't until we started catching these fish, and the larger ones, and seeing where they were hooked, that all of a sudden the light bulb went off. Is we're trying to use a hook to penetrate the lips in his front, not the bone in his mouth. So it's the Mutu 6050, which ironically enough is pretty much the same tuna hook you're using. So all the stuff you're using to go tuna fishing with, the only thing you need to modify to this whole operation is just 30-pound fluorocarbon. You can use the same tuna rods, and you can target these fish. You've already got the gogs from going tuna fishing. You've already got the pilchards. You've already got the sardines for chunks. If you're on a trip and you have leftover gear, this is a great way to go and fill the gap and make it, tuna one day, snapper the next day. It's a great trip. Questions on that so far? Good? Yes.
A little bit about fresh gogs. So
Okay.
I'm going to Bimini. I want fresh gogs. It's the best thing to do. Just catch them here, throw them in the live well, bring them over live, and just kill them before you go out in the morning. What do you suggest in terms of just best way?
It's
Someone who lives here, fishes Bimini, whatever, wants to fish live gogs. I mean fresh gogs, and catch them themselves, or maybe procure them. One of them.
So we started noticing the guys at the pier were catching a lot of gogs. Went down there and started doing it ourselves. The gog fishing around here is pretty good. You just have to put your time in, or you have to pay someone to do it for you. Let me give you some good substitutes for the gogs. Finger mullet, conch, fresh sardines. So if you can't get gogs, and I would say a good mutton trip, you're going to need 4 or 5 dozen baits. 4 or 5 dozen gogs will give you a great shot at some really trophy-sized fish.
And a case per drift of cut bait.
Case of drift of sardines, chunked small.
Case per drift.
Yeah, and I would say the drift should last no more than, I would work a half a mile area. I would drift a half a mile, pick up and reset on the same drift line. But remember, after you've laid those chunks down, the second drift is really where it starts to get good. You have to build the bite. All those triggerfish, all those grunts that are coming in to eat that stuff, all that's pulling the mutton snappers in. The more times that you can drift over that spot and in that area, it's usually drift 3 and 4 that is where we start to really see the trophies. Sometimes it's the first one, and that sets up the second one and the third one, but it's usually the third, the fourth drift. That's where things start to really materialize. Let me add something to this. You want to be in an area where there's not a lot of sharks, because you're not going to catch a snapper that big fishing in an area where there's tons of coral heads and you have a lot of critters, barracudas, sharks. You have to be out in the desert, 1-2 miles past the edge. So let's say you were north up towards Sandy Key. 1 or 2 miles up on the bank. At nighttime, I think I took Benny and Carter Andrews on a session in the Bahamas, and we fished on the north edge of Lily Bank. I think I was 4 or 5 miles up the bank in 22, 25 feet of water at night. That's another thing about this fishery. Sometimes you'll go to do this fishery and it'll be crickets during the day. I know that the nighttime is now the time to target these species. So it's not just day, it's day and night. Sometimes the nighttime is the right time, especially when we get close to the full moon. Right as that sun starts to set, it can be, it can be an incredible fishery once that sun sets up on the bank. That's where those fish go to spawn, as they go up in shallow water, They want to be somewhere where there's not going to be a lot of nuisance to them. I think they want to spawn and lay out in an area where they'll feel safe, but also a lot of food for them. And for them, it's crabs and conch. That's their main forage, crabs and conch.
So let's say it is a new moon. Is there a time of day where you would want to fish daytime?
I think if you get over there and it's slow, you might want to think about going in the afternoon. You know, somebody that's very funny has always said, well, we're going to find out when they bite because we're going to fish both tides from sunup to sundown, from moonrise to moonset. So we're going to figure it out. Oftentimes on the new moon can be a little bit tricky. Same thing with the full moon. You know, I geared up pretty heavy to go catch a full moon bite, and I think I was on the day of the full moon. Some friends of mine had just gotten back, and I think they had 60 fish. You know, kept their 20 fish limit, but they'd said that they had 60 muttons during a one-day session. Brought extra bait, extra hooks, extra line, extra rods, all kinds of prototype stuff to play with. And I think we ended up catching 2 muttons. But I did catch a swordfish on the way back on one drop. But it can be like that, and so can every fishery. It can be very good and consistent, and then we get right to the day before, sometimes the day after the full moon, and like a light switch, it can turn off. Those are 2 times that I would say it can be unpredictable. You know? Any questions on the muttons on the shallow bank? Ballyhoo is another good one. Ballyhoo is another great bait. Fishing medium-sized ballyhoo just like you would for a sailfish. Right through the bottom, limbered out, almost like a trolling bait. That's another excellent mutton bait. So if getting fresh gogs is difficult, you know, start thinking about alternatives. But the most critical part of that fishery is getting the bait to sweep and swim. If it's not sweeping and swimming, hard to get them in that absolute, you know, tremendous size. Yes, sir? No. But what I am doing is cracking the backs, and I'm pooping the baits, eyeballs out, just like you would for a rig circle hook bait or mahi bait or whatever you're rigging it for. Fresh, medium-sized ballyhoo, medium dinks. That's about the right size. That's another great alternative for a goggle eye. So in a perfect trip, you have a couple dozen ballyhoo, a couple dozen gogs, a couple cases of sardines. All else fails, go hire a local to take you conch fishing. You know? Let me think. So, Jordan, we good so far? Okay. So I think what we're going to do now is just take 5 minutes, and then what we're going to do is transition over to talking about jigging big groupers in the Bahamas. Because jigging big groupers in the Bahamas is absolutely another thing that I absolutely love to do. It's a completely different approach. Similar gear that I'm using for tuna fishing with a little bit of a twist on it. You know, but the big cuberas and the big groupers over in the Bahamas are, if you haven't done it before, it's definitely a bucket list thing. Catching 40, 50, 60-pound groupers over in the Bahamas is, you know, there's really no other fishery that's like that. And it's a lot easier than you'd think. Yes, sir?
What, any specific, you know, you like the outgoing tide, incoming tide, like what, if you had to pick a day, you know, you fishing 4 days before the moon, like what's your...
I think those fish get spawning right around May, and they'll spawn till through June. So for that 45-day period, it goes off. For 45 days, more or less, you know, take 10 days on either side of that. For 45 days, those fish are spawning, and they're in high numbers in those areas. I think maybe 1 or 2 days might shut it off during the moon. Day of the moon is usually not a good day. But I would say as long as you're within that 45 days of May to June, you're prime time.
Tide,
Tide doesn't matter. Time of day doesn't matter.
you're looking for clean water, murky water.
Doesn't matter. Nothing matters.
Nothing matters.
Absolutely nothing matters.
Just go to the bank.
Just go to the bank.
Just go on. Just go
Nothing
on.
matters. You know? As much as guys that I know that are high-end sail fishing, there's a few sort of signature days that you can say, like second day of a cold front. It's fairly unpredictable. Some days it goes off and there's no rhyme or reason for why it went off. It just went off. I would say mutton snapper is way more predictable.
They have to spawn, so they have to do whatever.
Something biologically is kicking with them. I had an interesting conversation with Rick Murphy, who said, one time we saw balls of mutton snappers in 1,200 feet mid-water spawning. Now, I've never seen that. Maybe that's a Keys thing. Maybe it's a Gulf thing. But the Bahamas, those fish spawn up on the bank. That's where they are, and that's what they're doing. And when they're spawning, they're hungry and they're feeding hard and heavy. There's no doubt about it. I mean, where are you? You and I had this discussion. You went over there, gave it a shot, and it's bang bang. It's go time. It's this area, these techniques, that time of year, this time of year. It's game on. You know, no, tide doesn't matter. Time of day doesn't matter. Yeah, there's certain things about, you know, they'll pattern out for, you know, sometimes I don't think it matters. I don't. I think right around that time, there's a handful of things that are happening in the Bahamas. I think the crabs are also on the march. I think the conch push in because the water starts to change temperature. I think a lot of fish in the springtime in the Bahamas are very sensitive to those water changes and the temperature changes. And you know, the temperature on the upper bank could be 82 degrees. The tide could push out and then push back in, but I think those fish they're pretty reliable, you know, reliable and steady. May to June, that's our bang time. I've tried this and I've caught them every month of the year in that same depth. But the numbers that we see from May to June is absolutely the peak of it. There's no doubt about it. The other thing we see is huge pushes of African pompanos. And I mean big African pompanos. 30 to 60 pound African pompanos are pretty, you know, it's not uncommon to see a couple during the day. It's not something we really mess with either, because I'm not going to kill them, and I have no interest in them. So if we do get into, you know, either big amberjacks or African pompanos, I like 30-pound tackle and 20-pound mono, because if it's a shark pompano, something we really don't want to mess with, it's a thumb, it's a pop, it's a re-rig, it's a start over again. You know, we're there to harvest meat.
What's the, you said that no grade in the Bahamas. Is there a reason?
Yeah. So big mutton snappers, when they'll eat the bait and you engage and the hook makes a purchase, it almost might feel like a shark at first. He's going to dump a lot of line. It's going to be a big steady burst. I want a lot of stretch in there. I want him to feel very comfortable going wherever he wants to go without really giving me what he's capable of. Because that same fish in 80 feet of water out front here is a completely different animal. But I think because the water temperature is so hot, he's just very lethargic. They fight a lot different. It's an unbelievable fight, but usually they come up relatively tired. I want a lot of stretch, and I want to play a lot of play in that line. The other thing is the water is so clear in that depth that if you don't have like a phantom presentation, you're not going to get that bite. You have to fish fluorocarbon, and that 20-pound mono, I think, makes it very difficult for them to get spooky. You know? Once a shark shows up, the show's kind of over. Like leapfrog up the beach another mile, start again. But in that depth range, normally we don't see a lot of that. So we can target them with some frequency because we don't have a lot of interference, you know? That same method, move up to a memory rock, move towards hens and chickens, move towards anywhere around Isaacs where you get that start to drop off. You can't fish the same way. You know, you're going to get busted off every single time. But again, those fish are up on the sand flats spawning. They're not on the reef structures. That's where the groupers live. You know, that's kind of going to be this segue where we go into, you know, cuberas and groupers. Any questions so far? No questions. Okay. Good. I'm glad I'm not good at explaining things. Let's see. You guys good over here? Okay. I want to talk about some Jigging World rods just for a minute if I can. You know, Mike's obviously an incredible rod builder. And if you're building custom rods, you know, the primary word in custom rod is the rod. And I think a lot of custom rods are absolutely spectacular because the quality of the materials and the effort that goes into the wrapping. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the blank. I think it's very critical that people take note of asking a lot of questions about the blank and making the good decision about what blanks we're building our rods on. Because there's a lot of different choices, but one thing I can say is the line technology's changed, the guide technology's changed, everything about fishing has changed, but for the most part, the rod technology stayed the same for the last 30 years. It wasn't until a couple of companies started introducing carbon tape into their builds, and that changed the way we use rods. So rods that I'm using with 10, 15-pound braid, you can literally pick up almost unlimited amounts of weight. It's not unlimited amounts of weight, but the rods are much lighter and they're much stronger. So carbon tape rods are definitely, in my opinion, changing fisheries across every board. For me, they changed. You can see the rod in the back here was my daytime swordfish rod. Carbon tape rods changed the way I daytime swordfish. Carbon rods have changed the way that I'm bait fishing. They've changed the way that I'm sail fishing. They've changed every aspect of the way I fish because I'm able to demand more performance out of a blank. I'm a rod geek. I'm a big fisherman. I like to take things to the edge of where we think we can take them and then keep going. But the only way to do that is to have newer technology that's pushing the edge of what the reels, what the line, what the hooks, what the angler, what the boats can do. So, you know, next time you're building a custom rod, and I don't care what it's for, you can pick up a lot of great custom rods or a lot of great production rods. But if you're going to go the custom rod route, check out some of our blanks. I definitely think that they're, you know, pushing the envelope of what performance really is all about. And I brought a few rods from our, you know, from our selection. We make about 180 different styles of rods. These are the rods that I have found to be the most perfect match for the fishery for mutton snapper fishing. 7.5-foot rod, a little bit of parabolic bend to it. On all of our conventional style rods, they're acid wrapped because you're going to get more performance out of the rod. But it's really the length and the weights that these rods are rated at. And doing the bait sweeping is critical to the fishery, you know. You need to be able to apply enough pressure to catch the fish, drive the hook, but also light enough that 30-pound leaders are going to chafe off. So if you have a chance, come up and let's just bend a few of these and have some fun with them. But, you know, definitely lighter and stronger than anything you're used to feeling. Any questions about any of that stuff? Move on to grouper. Skip the break. Keep trucking. Yeah. 5? Take 5. Take 5. Everyone take a stretch. Have a beer. Don't clap. Clap. So if I gave this to you, what would you build with this? I'd tell you what I would build with it. This would be a sailfish rod, like a.
I'd either use it for like a 20-pound spinning rod. 15,000. That I can cast to tailors because it's whippy tip.
So if we were sail fishing, we'd have 5-6 pounds of load on it, right about there, right? I mean, that's where I want the rod to perform, is right about there. But if I told you, you take a twin power 14,000 and put 65-pound braid, and you go catch, and you can whoop 100-pound tunas. Pull, 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 pull. Come on, I can pull, man.
It's unbelievable. That's awesome, man. So light too.
But the package which it's able to be delivered is just it's unbelievable. It's changing the industry.
Beautiful light, aesthetically pleasing rod.
Beautiful, man. It is something else. No doubt, I haven't seen nothing like that.
I think that's going to be the next. Grouper fishing over in the Bahamas is absolutely one of the most electric things that you can possibly do. If you haven't grouper fished in the Bahamas before, you haven't really experienced what like pinnacle of bottom fishing is all about. So I'm just going to keep this very simple in the sense that you need the right equipment to do it, because these fish are absolutely going to break almost anything you're going to throw at them. Like we were flexing some of these rods before, the carbon tape rods allow us to get unbelievable performance in a really tiny package. The amount that we can put on these rods is truly incredible. It's a braid fishery. So normally for grouper fishing, I don't like to recommend anything less than 50 pounds. 50 pound would be light. 65 or 80 would be ideal. I think a great in-between is 50 or 65. On the leader, I usually fish 60 or 80. And on the jigs, I'm using 160, 180, 200 gram size jigs. But these jigs are designed to really be optimal. You know, they're meant to present perfect within the first 5 feet of the water column from the bottom up. So these jigs are designed to hit the bottom and really flutter in that section. You don't want a speeding vertical jig when you're grouper fishing. You want something that's really going to work close to the bottom. You can do it in 2 formats. You can do it in spinning, or you can do it in conventional. I recommend a rod that really has a lot of lifting power, because in order to get those fish out of the rocks, you're going to need to punch them quick, hard, and fast real early. Once you set the hook, it's game on. He's going to come out of that hole, he's going to eat, and he's going to be back in the rocks right away. So it's a great thing to watch, because I'll see somebody hook a grouper, and as soon as they hook it, they're rocked up, and now they don't know what to do. Just a few simple tricks that I'll throw at you, a few nice little tricks. Best thing you can do is, if you get rocked up by a grouper, just go to free spool and sit and wait it out. That's all there is to it. Sit and wait it out. If the driver of the boat has to get back on top of the fish, get back on top of the fish, but always do it in free spool until he makes a move. Once he makes a move to go from one cave to another, back onto him. And you want to get him up as quick as you possibly can. I almost like to say, try and break the equipment. That's what it takes to get the fish out of the rocks sometimes. I like targeting these fish anywhere between 120 and 250 feet. That's sort of the magic zone for these fish. The other thing that's critical, completely everything different than mutton snapper fishing, is when you're grouper fishing, you really want to be around as much structure as you possibly can. Coral heads, drop-offs, spots where 2 bodies of water, like say an inlet, might converge in the eastern outer Bahamas, spots where there might be bait concentrations. Those are spots where the bigger grouper like to hang out, right? I also find that some of my best grouper fishing is on the back end of my yellowtailing. So if I happen to go yellowtailing in the Bahamas, which, again, you're only allowed to keep 20 demersal fish in the Bahamas, but sometimes if I'm there for a couple of days and I want to have a nice meal, yellowtailing is a great alternative to deep dropping. Because if I'm yellowtailing and I'm chumming real heavy, there's not a lot of shark activity, it's a great time to get in the water and go for a snorkel and see all the fish. But it's usually on the back end of the yellowtailing, right on the periphery of where we were yellowtailing, there'll be some big critters lurking around. Live yellowtail work great if you don't want to jig fish, but be prepared to just hook 10 and maybe catch a couple. I think the most effective way to target these fish, though, is jigging. Absolutely no question in my mind that once you get to about 120, 150, 200 feet, the boat starts to kind of get a little far away to bother the fish. And again, you know, when you're in an area like the Bahamas, I think any sort of noise distracts the fish. They will turn off until the boat gets away from them. Once the boat moves on, they'll tend to come back out of their hole and start to feed again. So on the bigger grouper, the blacks, that's mainly the one everyone's after, big black groupers. Big jigs. Hit the bottom, big sweep. Hit the bottom, big sweep. When you do connect, as quick and as hard as you can pound down on the fish. The Torium, the PGs, the power gear on our Ghost Hunter series rods. If any of you guys want, we can bend this rod. You know, it really does. It's like a 50 caliber. It really packs a punch in a very tight envelope. So this very light rod, you're able to kind of work and fish all day with ease. But when it comes down to it and you're really tight to them, I think what you can do with this, you'd need something about 4 times as big in its glass equivalent, which sort of changes the whole experience. You know, if I told you you needed a wire trolling rod to do the same thing that this does, you'd say, what? But that's the difference in the technology. Is carbon tape technology allows me to be able to comfortably jig all day, but when it really comes time to pack the punch and get the fish out of the rocks, you're going to need something that's got some backbone to it. The Ghost Hunter series, absolutely one of my favorite things. Just kind of stepping that back a little bit, another very popular, very productive fishery in the Bahamas is strawberry groupers. 60, 80, 100 gram jigs are more the size that we use for those critters. I find that when we're slow pitching in the Bahamas, barracudas can be a problem. So you're going to want a jig that stays close to where the fish that you want to catch are living on the bottom. These style jigs with double assist hooks, this is the style of jigs that you want to be fishing in the Bahamas for smaller grouper. You know, we have tons of jigs that have a single assist hook, then those are meant more for working bodies of water, like for tuna fishing, where you might be working 200 or 300 feet of water in a column and the jig is streaking through the water. Different hook setup, different application. These kinds of jigs are meant to be slow pitched off the bottom. So if you're going to get into the jigging thing, make sure that you're matching the correct jig to what you're trying to catch. This is a great, in my opinion, one of the best things that you can bring to the Bahamas to just, if you only got an hour to do it and you want to fill the box, that's a great way to do it. Any questions about that? Yes?
Preschool, and I've done that, but never waited long enough to get. How do you know in 150 feet of water that he's got out of one rock and headed for the next?
Okay. So there's a lot less current in the Bahamas. Sometimes with the wind and the tide, yeah, it can pick up, but it's not as bad as here. When you do get a big grouper, and you know it's not a shark because the shark will just basically just continue to go. He gets you into a rock. I go limp and soft on the line. I might pan off 40 or 50 feet off the reel so he doesn't feel me, I don't feel him. Wait it out. Because eventually he's going to come out. It's just a waiting game, you know? And you as the angler kind of have to have a very tight connection between what you just hooked and how much he pulled to get you to where he got. And you have to kind of make that determination. Did this feel like a real big fish? Did it feel like kind of a small fish? Usually a good rocked up grouper will try and get into a hole as quick as he possibly can, but he didn't really think about staying there a long time. He just thought about hiding real quick. He's going to come out of that hole. You have to wait it out. But the critical part to that is you have to pan out enough line that he doesn't feel you at all. So the braid, that's where the braid comes into play. If you had heavy mono, he would feel the drag, the scope in his face. He wouldn't leave the hole. There's also too much stretch in the mono for you to be able to effectively get him out. Braid, I like to use a little bit of a shorter section. So maybe 2 arm pulls at the most. But again, comes back to the rod. Being able to feel what's happening when it's happening is critical. If your equipment's too big and you don't really know what's going on, you're not really connected to the fish.
What about using a trolling?
Unbelievable. But again, I think if you use a trolling motor and you get on top of where you are, he's not going to leave the hole. You have to give a little bit of, I'm going to give him a lot of line and I'm going to drift off a little bit. And then I'm going to kind of wait here for a little while. But make him feel comfortable enough to leave where he's living. And you'll know, because all of a sudden the rod will load up again and he's on. But you really need to be able to apply heavy amounts of drag very quickly. I would recommend wearing gloves, thumbing the spool. You know, the O'Shea Jigger has like a lock mode.
I have that same thorium with the white handle, but like a bigger size.
This one? The Trinidad. Trinidad. Fine reel. Just make sure that the line you're using and the rod you're using is appropriate to what you just hooked. Because you're not catching a 60-pound black on that outfit in the rocks. You're going to need something with a little more gunpowder to the back end. Yeah. You ever shot a bear with a 22? It's not going to kill him. It's just going to make him mad. So just kind of coming back to it, rig for the fish you want to catch. If you're after trophies, rig for trophies. If you're out to just catch fun food, rig for that stuff. You know, hope that answers the question. Any other questions? Because I want to give enough time to spend a little bit of time with people one-on-one. Any other questions, guys? Good? Got hit with a lot of stuff.
Sorry, could you elaborate on the hook set up on the small jigs? The difference between you said that's a double hook?
Yep. So on the vertical jigs or the slow pitch jigs, and we could talk about this, you know, one-on-one, but the jig, the hook, the method that it all comes together is a very fine balance, right? When you're slow pitching and you're pitching for a certain size fish, you want to deliver a certain hook shape, and everything about that jig is very well balanced. Once we start talking about going for 100-pound tunas, we need to kind of shift the whole balance between the line and the hook. Here what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to accomplish a very delicate presentation with as light of a hook as we can get away with, but still make something that if it gets bit, it's going to connect to the fish. So if you see the way these are rigged, it's a little lighter on the lighter size jigs, it's heavier on the heavy size jigs, and on the streaker jigs, it's a completely different setup. You know, there's a lot of time and effort that go into balancing all this stuff perfectly. If you're going to get into vertical jigging, just get stuff that's designed right, not designed cheap. Yeah, on this series, on all this series, they come fully dressed.
You like the way they come?
Yeah, they're dressed to perfection.
Tuna jigs too?
The tuna jigs, the streaker jigs that are over there, yes. The only thing is, we do make a different style of assist hook with much heavier paracord. So you can scale that all the way up to, you know, and match it to the style of fish you're catching. So, yeah. So the fish we catch up in the Northeast require a slightly different hook than the tunas we catch elsewhere. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and those jigs are designed for open water. These jigs are designed to really perform, you know, within a few feet of the bottom. You want it to come up and kind of wiggle back down. It's staying in the strike zone longer. So, any other questions? I think we covered a lot of stuff. Good?
When you butterfly the gogs, I've seen, you know, like Mike sometimes you cut the backbone out and stuff. Do you like to do that or just leave the tail on all the time?
I leave on as much meat as I can. I feel like the tail acts like a good paddle. If Mike and I were to go head and head on things, when the spawn is on, it's on. But for me, when the spawn is on, there's a lot of triggers that are there as well. The more meat and the more stuff that I can put back there, I feel like the better off I am. But more importantly, when I pull the bait back, if you notice the butterflied gogs, like right on the last few cranks, as it's coming up to the boat, it looks alive. It's really swimming hard. It really does look incredible. You know, a lot of people don't know it, but that's a great, you know, marlin pitch bait. You know, we used to do it in Mexico all the time, except the bait is called a caballito, not a goggle eye. Yeah, we used to butterfly them, and they would look alive. So, yes, sir.
Why do we care what these silver jigs look like if we're 150 feet away?
Sometimes glow can have an effect. I think it's good to kind of carry a quiver. You know, if I had to choose a color, I would say I couldn't really choose a color because one day it's one color, the next day it's another color. 150 feet of water, once you start to get into a depth where the light starts to dissipate.
Well, I mean, you lose the red at what, 12 feet or so, I forgot all that.
That might be so, but you know, they might see a lot of UV colors that we don't see. And those fish often, to survive and for protection, they have to be able to see in the dark. And they don't have eyelids, so that they're looking, you know, they have to look in the night in dark places.
So you find it does make a difference.
I find the deeper you go, you want to start to add glow into the mix, you know?
Well, that I understand.
Yeah. As a rule of thumb, once we get to about 100 feet of water, the light's going to dissipate by about 50%. Maybe I'm off on those numbers, but you get to 100 feet of water, and it's going to be a lot less light than it was at the surface. I think, yeah, I think something with glow in it, you know, again, yeah, the glow can definitely help, but also sometimes silver and the way it refracts the light above it and a more subtle approach might be a better approach. That's why I try to carry a couple different colors. And if I have 4 or 5 guys jigging, I always try and have everyone have a different color, unless the guy who just caught it on the glow jig just caught 3 fish to everyone else caught nothing. We might start switching over to glow jigs. You know? Like when you're mahi fishing, sometimes they're all over green. But blue and white's a great color too.
Well, yeah, there's something they can see those colors, so in the light, sure,
Yeah.
those colors show up on the surface, but at depth, I've always wondered, some of those colors won't even show up at all at that depth.
You'd be surprised that sometimes darker colors, deeper water, are more effective than brighter colors in deep water. Those fish are physiologically designed to hunt in that depth in low light. And I think a lot of it is movement too. For grouper, it's a reaction bite. I think they detect something that's potentially edible, and I think it's, you know, if you were to, I wrote an article about the science behind the feed. Tunas tend to lunge to capture their food, right? Tarpon will go up and suck it in. Grouper, same thing. I think groupers come up and open that big mouth and create a vacuum that pulls whatever's in front of it into its mouth. And then it closes its mouth and it determines whether it wants to keep it there or not. So the style of the feed for that species is a vacuum, and sometimes just a subtle flicker is enough to make them go and suck it in, which is enough time for you to drive the hook. You know, and you don't necessarily know what they're feeding on from time to time. You know, that's why I think different colors are critical in a lineup. I always like to, if something's not working, change it until you do find a pattern. But as a rule of thumb, the deeper we go, the more we like to kind of add some glow to it as a starter and then back off from there. But yeah, you know, I've noticed at sword fishing, my number one swordfish bait is a dark green squid at 200 feet of water. Why? I don't know, but it is.
I've got to buy a bunch more of these because they were all stolen in Mexican airport. They had no hooks on them, but they stole them.
Well, we could talk a little more in person about what I think the species you want to target and the rod and the outfit. You want to kind of balance everything together. But any other questions before we kind of turn it over to Jordan? We good? Guys, thank you very much. Jordan, thanks for having us. I guess it's beer time.
Beer time. Just want to say thank you everyone for coming and supporting us. And Seth's a great guy, speaker. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to him one-on-one. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.